First off, we have Simon Hahn. Simon is the author of Nights When Nothing Happened, which was named an Indie Next Great Read and a Best Book of the Year by the Washington Post, Time, and Harper's Bazaar. His stories and essays have appeared in The Atlantic, Virginia Quarterly Review, Texas Observer, Guernica, Electric Literature, and the Paris Review's The Daily. He was born in Tianjin, China, and raised in several cities in Texas. Thank you so much, Simon, for joining us today. Our next panelist is Jasmine Mendez. Jasmine Mendez is a Dominican-American poet, educator, playwright, and award-winning author. Mendez has had poetry and essays published by or forthcoming in the New England Review, Kenyon Review, Gulf Coast, The Rumpus, and others. She is the author of 2 multi-genre collections, Island of Dreams, which won an International Latino Book Award, and Night Bloomin' Jasmine, personal essays and poetry. Her debut poetry collection, Machete, will be released in 2022. Her second YA memoir, A Bucket of Dirty Water, Memories of My Girlhood, and her debut poetry book, Josefinas Habituelas, will be released in 2021. She is an MFA graduate of the Creative Writing Program at the Rainier Writing Workshop at Pacific Lutheran University and a University of Houston alumni. Thank you, Jasmine, for joining us. And our last but not least, our last panelist is Jessica Wilbanks. Jessica Wilbanks is the author of When I Spoke in Tongues, a memoir about faith and its loss. She has received a Pushcart Prize as well as Creative Nonfiction Awards for Ninth Letter, Sycamore Review, Red Divider, and Ruminate Magazine. Her essays have received notable mentions in Best American Essays and Best American Non-Required Reading, and she was selected as a finalist for the PEN Annual Literary Award in Journalism. She lives in Houston and is currently working on a novel. Thank you, Jessica, for joining us. Okay, so let's get started with this conversation. I want to spend some time with each of you just to give you a chance to talk about yourselves outside of your bios, and to give the audience and myself some more time to get to know you. So my first question is sort of a 2-part question. So I'm hoping that each of you can talk about your experiences with writing the personal. When do you pull from personal experiences? Which of your works have been influenced by or about your personal experiences? And the second part of this question is, I'm always just curious about why people write what they write. So if you want to talk a little bit about what compels you to tell your own stories in this way, because it can be a really vulnerable experience. And is this something that you always knew you wanted to do, or did it just come about as you were figuring out what it was that you were passionate about writing about? So Jasmine, I can start with you if that's okay.
Sure. So the first part of the question was, yeah, so I live in Houston and I have a daughter and a husband, and I've written since I was a kid, but didn't necessarily see myself as a writer, because I didn't see writers that looked like me very often, and especially not like Dominican authors or characters in books. So I just never assumed that I could be like a published writer, right? You know, I wrote and I journaled and I wrote, you know, sort of my teen angsty poems and all of that when I was 13. And then I wrote in college as well, but again, didn't necessarily like, I wasn't going to go out there and like call myself a writer. But I did start doing performance poetry, spoken word and slam in college as well. And all of that was always the personal. It was always my experience, my sort of identity crises and figuring out, you know, who am I? 'Cause that's what you do in your 20s. And it was all very much, always has been the personal, both my poetry and obviously my personal essays come from that lived experience. That's what I had known. And I write from that place because again, it is what I know, but it's also stories that are not often read or seen in sort of this canonical literature, or even just I didn't see any of that in any of the books that I read, whether on my own independently or in the classroom, really. First time I saw anything close to my own story was as a junior in AP English Lit, and I read when I was Puerto Rican. We were studying memoir and we got to choose memoir, and I saw the word Puerto Rican, and I'm Dominican, but I was like, that's close enough. And I got so excited, and I fell in love with Esmeralda Santiago and her writing. But then I wasn't really into like prose writing necessarily. It wasn't until prose and memoir was like my first publication, sort of by happenstance. I took a memoir and Mexican American literature creative writing course in college. And then the professor from that course decided to create an anthology from the various courses that she had taught. And so she invited me, no, she asked if she could use one of the pieces that I wrote for class to be included in that anthology. And I was like, yes. And it just sort of like happened. And I was like struck by that moment. And when I saw like my name in print, I was like, oh, this is something else, it was really surreal. And so from there, I was like, well, I've got something, I guess. And I just sort of kept writing and kept doing the poetry thing, really got into memoir and essay because I felt like I had too much to say. I was like, poetry just isn't enough right now. So I need to write, memoir. I need to tell this in like a longer form. And then I've come to fall in love with the collage essay and the lyrical essay because I can merge, I don't have to lose my poetic voice and my poetic self to write memoir. And I really appreciate knowing that now. And yeah, I've always written, my philosophy for writing is the Toni Morrison quote where she says, if there's a book you want to read that hasn't been written, then you must write it. And so when I've written any of the stories, any of the personal essays and memoirs that I've written, it comes from that place, feeling like I've scoured, I've looked through all the shelves and I've been looking for this story because I want something that relates to my experience and never finding it. My book, Night Blooming Jasmine, about chronic illness and infertility as a woman of color, did not exist. I mean, I looked, right? And all I kept finding was like white women with cancer, which is a fine story, right? We need those books too, but I was not seeing chronic illness, in Black women and Latina women on the shelves anywhere. And so I wrote with that intention. I always, if other folks like my books, great. But if you don't, it's not for you. Like it's for women of color. Like everything I write is for predominantly Black, Indigenous women of color, period. And so, yeah, that's because it's my experience. It's the stories that I want told and that I want to share. And so I write from that place with that intention, very much so.
Yeah, thank you so much. Jessica, how about you?
So I'll start like Jasmine did. I'm in Houston also, so recovering from all the trouble of last week, like so many people are. And I've thought of myself as primarily a nonfiction writer for probably the last 10 or 15 years, and I published a memoir. I published a bunch of essays and then published a memoir in 2018. And shortly after that, decided to write a novel, which was the project that kind of scared me the most, the place where I felt most kind of unsure-footed, but has really been a wonderful experience so far. Like I'm still very much in the generative stage. I'm drafting, putting the first draft together and finding my kind of personal obsessions creeping into that a lot. So similar to Jasmine, for me, I always loved to read as a kid. I dreamed of being a writer and, drew pictures of my future writer self. But I didn't really kind of find my niche with nonfiction writing until I really started reflecting about kind of some of the big sources of conflict and tension in my life so far, which, one of the primary pieces was growing up Pentecostal in a really rural community in Southern Maryland. When I was 16, deciding to leave the church after having been very devout and realizing that meant a real break between my family of origin, my hometown, my community, the path that was charted out for me as a kid, and then, going from that community to an extremely progressive liberal arts college in Massachusetts, Hampshire College, which is lots of cognitive dissonance when you grow up in a Pentecostal church and go to a very liberal college. So I think what really drew me to nonfiction was, I think we often tend to write about subjects that, have become an obsession. And for me, at least, one of the points of obsession with my background is that I couldn't really intellectually reconcile all the good things about my family and my community and my childhood faith with all of the values that I have now as an adult. It just didn't, there was a lot, it was very fraught, very fraught. And I think part of the reason that I kept writing about it was because I just didn't understand it. And when you're writing about something that you don't really understand, I find that it opens up so much creative freedom. You're not approaching your story from kind of a place of cliche, you don't really know how it ends. And I just enjoyed that form so much. So one of my first published pieces was an essay that I wrote about my dad and his anger. So he passed away this year, but he was a bricklayer, very bad temper, and our house was pretty tumultuous. And I wrote this very personal piece about his anger, how it affected my brothers and I, and how I struggle with anger kind of as a result. So that was kind of a baptism by fire, like when, my mom is like, oh, have you written anything lately? And I'm like, well, actually, there's this very personal piece about our family that's going to come out. And it came out in a small literary journal. And I thought, no one will ever read it. I don't have to share it. And then ended up winning a pushcart prize. And I had to tell my family about it. And there's a lot to tell about that story. But yeah, so that then later I wrote about, other personal topics. I wrote the memoir about kind of my journey leaving the church, which ironically started off as narrative nonfiction. I didn't see it as like a literary book, really. I was in an MFA program, but I kept thinking like, man, if I didn't have this stupid kind of MFA mandate to write a literary story, I would make it just narrative nonfiction. And then eventually, I learned that kind of for me, the power of the story was actually the personal arc, starting out being devout and then, choosing to leave and needing to reconcile, those two very disparate experiences. So yeah, that's a little taste of how the topic comes out in my writing.
Yeah, thank you, Jessica. And we're definitely going to come back to that essay that you mentioned. I read it in preparation for this panel, and it's beautiful, and we're going to talk about it. But yeah, so Simon, what about you?
Thanks, Sam. And yeah, thank you for having me. It's really wonderful to be here with y'all. Yeah, I think that I also, always was kind of a storyteller as a kid. I would make books and tie paper with yarn and like try to sell them to my parents at ridiculous prices. And, and I was an only child growing up, and I learned very early how to kind of play different roles, and particularly all the different like Power Rangers and things like that. And I think that is something I also learned to do as a reader, right? Like I learned to put myself in the lives of people who didn't look like me, who really shared very few, like on the surface level, common experiences with me. And even, in high school, I don't think we read a single Asian American writer in English classes, like not even like Amy Tan or Maxine Hong Kingston. And it wasn't until college that, I had a professor who, recommended a lot of writers to me who I've never heard of, like, a writer like Gish Jen, who has a story who's Irish, in which it's told from perspective of a Chinese grandmother who it's a first person story that is even like written in like quote unquote broken English. And it's just something I didn't know you could even put on the page, because again, didn't have a model for that. And so I really love what you said, Jasmine, about, how do you center your experience on the page? And I think part of that is like letting something I had to learn was that I didn't have to always be the one trying to mold myself to other people. Like I could also write a story in which readers would have to do the same thing that I did growing up, is making that leap into my characters and my stories. But that took a long time to get there. And a lot of the fiction, especially, I shouldn't say especially fiction, but I do think, even my students now sometimes have this misconception that fiction has to stray as far as possible from your real life, otherwise it's not fiction. And so that's something that I continue to think about even for myself. The more I bring the personal, like my novel on the surface level has a lot of similarities to my life. I like my characters. I was born in Tianjin, China. I grew up in Texas. I spent a good deal of my adolescence in the suburb of Dallas, Plano. That is the setting of my novel. And but honestly, beyond that, the what's quote unquote like from my life is really more emotional, or it's more in the questions that I asked of the characters. And that was really necessary, that in some ways the characters had to be very different from me and my family, because I think I needed at some point I needed the mask of fiction, I guess. I needed to be able to put some of the weird thoughts and feelings that I have into the hearts and minds of characters who may be like me or may not be like me, and I find that really interesting, an exercise to even like have a character I would despise in real life to make an observation about the world that sometimes I would share in. I think like that creates a dynamic in which it's almost like you're keeping yourself a little bit accountable. Like you're not necessarily the all-knowing godlike writer who controls everything. You have to deal with some very unsettling questions about yourself, but you get to do it through fiction, which is nice. So I really admire Jasmine and Jessica, y'all writing nonfiction, because when I also have been writing essays, but I tend to stray away from memoir. It's more like cultural criticism, and I do bring some of the personal, but yeah, I would love to hear how you do it.
Yeah, thank you, Simon. And you're actually speaking to my next question. So I'm gonna stick with you for this, and then we'll move to everyone else. But I'm wondering what everyone's process looks like when you're figuring out what form to tell a story in, and how do you know if something should be an essay or a poem or a novel or a memoir or a short story, and what do these various forms sort of offer you as a storyteller? And so you're already kind of talking to that in the fiction realm. So if you want to sort of expand on that, please do.
Yeah, sure. I guess, the easy answer is that just, I feel like I know fiction the best, and it just, for whatever reason, is like the default mode that I initially think of. But that being said, I think now that I've been starting to write more essays, I have started to see a difference in what makes an essay versus a story. And I think it kind of deals with how I want to approach a question that I have. If I want to approach it through characters and sort of going through some sort of event in their lives, like through the narrative of fictional characters, or do I want to approach it maybe more directly without the mask of fiction and sort of directly responding to the question, more often in nonfiction with research. And I think the two can be sort of complementary. I have been writing more essays that have sort of come out of my fiction. For example, like having a book out in the world, I've had to sort of think about how I present myself as a writer. I tend to I don't walk around thinking about myself as an Asian American writer or something. Like but that becomes a public persona that then you have to negotiate what that means or like an immigrant writer. And so these questions have continued to linger. And I thought, okay, this is maybe something for nonfiction, to sort of clarify what I'm doing in my fiction. I think oftentimes in my fiction, I do that because I know that there's no way I can approach the question except through a story, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you so much. It definitely does make a lot of sense. Jasmine, I'm going to come to you now, and I'm also going to tack on another sort of little question, because I know that you work a lot in hybrid storytelling, and I read Night Blooming Jasmine, and that is poetry and essays. So I'm also wondering why hybrid works are sort of the form you choose to tell your stories in as well.
I'm the worst person to ask the first question too, because people are always like, how do you decide what genre to write in? I'm like, I don't, the writing decides for me. It evolves. I can always come in with an intention and say, I'm going to write this poem. And then 2 years into revising that poem, it's like, no, this poem needs to be an essay. I write a lyrical essay and then I strip it away and I'm like, oh, it's actually a poem. Or I write a collection of poems that is now a play because this is my life. And so I sort of listen to the work and I sort of let it lead me. Like I write until there's like a moment where it's like, oh, this is what it wants to be, right? Or this is what it's begging to be. This is the form that it wants to take. But as far as like the book projects themselves, the reason that I believe in this intersectional hybrid form is because I have intersectional identities. I am not one thing or one form. And in order for me to tell my complete story, I believe in using multiple genres, multiple forms in order to express that experience, to tell that story. And I think that a lot of Western literature and the way that it is framed and structured is very oppressive and very like white supremacist, and like these are the structures that are imposed and you have to have this narrative arc and it has to do this thing and has to be this one way. And like I'm not that. Like I come from Indigenous people and I come from Africans and I come from slaves and I come from all of that. And I feel like for me, the hybrid genre is able to kind of tell the stories in the way that my people tell stories, through song and through lyricism and through music and through the storytelling and through confessional writing, whatever that means, right? We just kind of lay it bare and tell these stories in these ways. And that's mainly where it comes from, is this idea of like these intersectional identities that I inhabit, therefore there's intersectional form. It also, just comes from, again, grappling with difficult subjects, right? There are things, especially in Night Blooming Jasmine, that I was not ready to write about in essay form or in a narrative form. And they took the forms of poems because I was speaking from a place of like deep emotion, and I was not necessarily ready to write from a place of like, this is what happened, in particular, like my finger amputation. I touched sort of very lightly on my hands and sort of the journey of my hands. Because at the time that I wrote Night Blooming, like it just wasn't a place that I was willing or ready to go. I wasn't ready to be that vulnerable on the page with regard to the trauma of my finger amputation. And so now I'm working on a poetry collection in which my editors are strongly nudging me to write the hard stuff that I don't want to write, but it's time, right? It's time to tell that story. And so, I'm open to that, and I'm willing and ready to do the work in order to be that vulnerable, because even though in Night Blooming there was a lot of, it was just very raw, I guess, for lack of a better word. I just kind of put it all out there. But it still didn't feel as vulnerable as this current poetry collection is feeling right now. Because there's also, this is a hybrid in the sense that there's images, there's CT scanned images of my fingers, of my hands, X-ray images, sort of also pictures right now of the journey of the gangrened fingertip, and sort of all these things that are very, very vulnerable. And we're looking at sort of the archive, right? So this idea that like everyone has like we all have our own archives, right, of information, of stuff, like this paper trail, the social media trail, like all these things that are contributing to the narrative of our lives, to the story of our lives. But also juxtaposed with the fact that so many of my ancestors and the people that I come from do not have that. And there is so much erasure and so much silence and so much oppression with their stories, right? Which is another reason why I tell my stories, because for too long, the people that I come from were not able to tell their own stories. They don't have an archive. They don't have documents that prove that they existed, right? And so I am here in some ways to try to rectify that. It's a really long answer and I kind of spiraled, but yes.
Thank you. And writing into the archive sort of reminded me about Carmen Maria Machado in The Dream House, and how she is literally writing into this archive that does not exist. And that is so true for so many of us. Jessica, what about you?
Jasmine, I feel like as you're talking, I'm having so many kind of new insights about why I made some of the choices that I did with fiction and nonfiction. I don't think I ever really realized it before, but I think when I was in college, when I was kind of taking fiction, writing workshops and kind of trying to master the form of fiction, I think I felt really insecure. I think I felt like, plot was something that either worked or it didn't, and you had to kind of find the right plot, or, the whole story was crap. And I don't think I've named to myself the freedom that I found in nonfiction. I felt like in fiction, there was this kind of skeleton of plot where you felt like that really dictated, where you went. Or I think this was just kind of the wrong view that I had about fiction at the time. But with nonfiction, when I was reading, work by nonfiction writers that I love, I was just blown away by all the things you could do. You can incorporate research, you can be very grounded in themes, you can go on long discursive, tangents about all kinds of pieces. And as a writer, I'm really drawn to weaving different types of worlds together. I think it comes from my background. It's trying to fuse the Pentecostal world with the more academic or progressive world. But in nonfiction, I felt like I could do all that. I didn't have to just perform this kind of carefully structured plot and execute it. I could really play. And there's a book that I stumbled upon recently, and I can't remember the writer's name, but it was published by Catapult. It's called Meander, Spiral, and Explode. And it's this wonderful book about many of the pieces that you mentioned, Jasmine, about how the traditional concept of narrative that's taught, that I've taught, that I grew up learning, which is really focused on this kind of 3-act structure and this point of a climax. The author deconstructs that and explains how, in many ways it's very much this domineering form that closes off meaning rather than kind of exposes new ways to tell stories, new areas of meaning. Jane Allison, thank you, Becca. I appreciate that. So yeah, I think that, the answer I was going to say was that, for so long, nonfiction has just been the form that I've gone to. But if I really reflect on it, I think that for me, nonfiction, kind of exemplified this way of thinking and talking that just felt so much more natural to me and kind of sort of mediated by all the conventions of plot and storytelling. Yeah, it makes me really thoughtful about now I want to just think about whether I'm going back to all those old beliefs in my novel or whether I'm actually doing it differently. I'm not sure. I'm sorry. I feel like that's a really anti-fiction comment, but clearly that's not my goal.
No, yeah, thank you. And that's really nice of you to say too, because I've heard, I think, the opposite more frequently, in that fiction gives you the freedom to sort of do whatever you want, and nonfiction is more it has to be the truth or something. But yeah, thank you for saying that. So my next question is just sort of general advice for someone who is getting ready to write about their personal experiences. What would you say to someone who is trying to figure out how to connect the threads, how to figure out how to like plot their life into something that looks like a story. And then this can be for any genre, and you can speak to the genres that you feel most comfortable writing in. But yeah, Simon, I'll come back to you.
Yeah. I guess I would say two things. First is, it's writing the personal is something that I feel like a lot of writers feel they have to do because of some sort of outside pressure. And I think this is probably a bigger pressure on minority writers and writers who have, say, have spoken publicly about experiencing some kind of trauma, and then suddenly it's like, oh, this is a great story, you got to write about it. And I think that first, before you even do it, like, ask yourself, like, what are you trying to get out of that, right? And like, whether you're ready to do it, just like you're saying, Jasmine. Because because writing is great and all, but if it's going to harm you more, like, it's not worth it. It's just not. But if you feel you're ready, like, I guess I can speak for fiction. Something that's also maybe to keep in mind, and this is really a reminder to myself, but you can always revise. And so in my fiction, I find that, like, in first drafts, there's like more of the overtly personal in it, whether I'm trying to do it or not. And sometimes I'm trying to do more and more of the personal, and sometimes I'm trying to write a story that doesn't really have much of it, but like, there's only so much I can imagine, like, out of the blue in my head. And so, like, down to like sometimes where the characters were born, or like the names of the characters being names of people I know. Making stuff up is hard. So sometimes the personal is like a kind of scaffolding for a draft, right? It helps me to finish the story. And then, in revision, you're able to get some distance from it. And then, I ask myself, like, okay, I look at, like, do I need this scaffolding? Where would the story benefit from more fictionalizing, right? Because ultimately in fiction, your allegiance is to the story and not the facts. And so, like, I'll try to be brief, but like, just give an example from my novel. Like, there's a central home in the novel that in my first drafts really resembled a home that I spent time in Plano. And so in my first drafts, when the boy is like tiptoeing down the hall, I was like imagining myself tiptoeing down the hall, and that helped me fill in some of those sensory details, right? And but through revision, I decided to make the house bigger than the house that I grew up in. I gave it more space, but also more hollowness. I gave it like cupboards with no dishes in them, and a room that no one, like, with nothing in it really, except for like almost was like storage. And that was trying to get at some kind of atmosphere that I wanted to bring to this particular story, but not necessarily like it didn't really match my memory of my own home. And I introduced objects to the home that I never grew up with. There's this sheepskin rug that the mother in my novel really loves, and it led to this this odd thing I made up about, like, the mother once at Home Depot, like, rubbing a rug around on her cheek because it was just so soft. And it was so odd, and my mom would never be caught dead doing something like that in public. But for this character who lacked a level of a physical intimacy in her life, I think it kind of was moving to me to give that detail to her. So I guess I would say I realize maybe I'm answering the opposite of what you're asking, in that sometimes in fiction, like, real life or the personal can almost be a barrier to, like, getting at what you really want to say, because what is really in the personal of that scene is like my own sort of questions about intimacy, right? And I wanted to explore that on a personal level, but I had to do that with a detail that never existed in my life or with my own mother.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the beauty about fiction too, and it gives you sort of like these avenues for exploring the things that you're obsessed with and the questions that you're asking, and you don't feel like you have to stick to the absolute truth, whatever that means, like you would in like nonfiction that asks for this truth. Thank you, Simon. So Jasmine, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, similar to Simon, I'm just gonna echo a couple of things and maybe throw in some new things. But my first big point, I would say, is just because you write something doesn't mean anyone has to read it. So, and I had to, as coming from the performance poetry, spoken word world, and I was an actress in a former life all through college, middle, elementary. I always felt like everything had to be performed, everything had to be shared, everything has to be shared. And when I finally got rid of that mentality and just wrote, like word vomited on the page, more beautiful things started happening, and I became free to write whatever, because all my scribbles didn't have to be shared with the world. So that's my first thing, is like, write what you need to write and don't think about who is or isn't going to read it. Like, just get it on paper, because if you have that impetus inside of you to tell these stories, there's something there and you should honor that. And so just write it, right? And then two, take some time away. Like, if it is something, if you're like, no, but I want to get published or I want to put it out in the world, take that time away, and then come back to revise, because the real writing is in the revision. That is what I truly believe. And I loathe revision until I'm actually doing it. When I'm in revision, I'm like, this is my jam. But like, getting to like my desk in order to revise, I'm like, oh, I'm probably going to hate everything that I ever wrote, 2 weeks ago, and I'm going to want to burn it all down and, just like go become like a cosmetologist or something, and never write a word, but then that usually, it doesn't actually happen. Like, I'll like love, 30% of it, and then like, 60% of it. And then there's like this other little gray area. But yeah, and then going back to what Simon had said also, and I share this in all of my workshops, especially when we're talking about memoir or personal essay. Yes, writing can be therapy, but therapy is therapy. And if you are not ready, like I said before, to write about a thing, don't re-traumatize yourself. There is no need for that. It took me 5 years to write about my miscarriage, because every time I came to the computer, I was like, just like, I'd write a paragraph and just start bawling. And then finally I was like, why am I doing this to myself? Like, clearly this is not a thing right now. Like, I can't, what? Like, why, I need to go see an actual therapist. Like, I don't need to like sit here and try to like work out my trauma on the page. And then of course the therapist is like, you should journal. And I'm like, I'm a writer. Anyway, so there's that, right? But I just think that like, you should listen to yourself and listen to what happens when you start to write about a thing, and decide if you're ready to write about it. And if you really do want to write about it, is there another way in which you can enter the subject matter that will allow you then to discover what it is that you want to say about the thing that you're trying to say, but that maybe you can't say directly, if that makes sense, right? I'll just give a quick example that I wrote a hermit crab essay, which is where you take one form of a type of writing, and like a recipe, for example, right? And you write a topic, or you write on a topic using that format. And I taught in middle and elementary school and high school for many years. But I've never been able to write about my students, and I really struggle with writing about school violence and school shootings. It's something that is very triggering for me. But I ended up writing a hermit crab essay using a lesson plan format, in which the lesson of the day is like how to survive a school shooting. And I was able to enter that space, and those drills, those lockdown drills that I had to experience as a teacher, using a sort of what felt like at first a very like rigid, cold sort of format, right? Like the lesson, the objective, the materials, the lesson plan for the day, the modifications, the assessment, etc. Right? And so that was the way in which I was able to enter this subject matter that was very difficult for me. So sometimes that helps, right? Like, if you want to write about your mom's cooking and being in the kitchen, like, could you write a recipe, like an essay in the form of a recipe to describe this relationship? Or if you want to talk about your relationship with your dad, and your dad was a mechanic, are there, like templates from some sort of a mechanic manual that could help you start to like approach this subject matter that is difficult. But again, assessing like, am I ready to write about it? And really thinking about the questions that you don't have to have an answer to. Like your essay doesn't have to answer the question. You can literally just be asking questions, right? Which is something difficult for me to also like come to terms with, right? I don't have to share my writing and I don't have to answer all the questions with my writing. And being okay with that, like just allowing yourself to be like good with not knowing, you know, this answer or where the piece is going, and always come back to revise. So.
Yeah, thank you, Jasmine. And I think we're going to come back to a lot of things that you touched on, but I also just want to mention, thank you for saying that if something is traumatic or difficult for you to write, like you can always come back to that later. You don't have to write about it right now. And yeah, so Jessica, what is your advice for people who are thinking about writing about their personal lives?
Well, I'll do a quick side note. Like in preparation for this presentation, I found this like piece of writing that I did when I was 19 that I got feedback on from a creative writing teacher in college. And the reason it came to mind was because one of his comments was, the assignment is not me, myself, and I, which is the name of this panel, which at the time was like very difficult to hear, you know, and I dug it up today. I wrote about this on Instagram, but I dug it out of my shed and looked at it because I was really curious if it deserved that comment, you know, or if maybe he just couldn't appreciate my 19-year-old story. And it really did deserve the comment. Like I can't stress that enough. And when I look at what was wrong, because I'm a huge believer that the way into a story is not through thinking, it's through writing. And it's, you know, you're not gonna, like I really discourage people that, you know, in writing classes from outlining, you know, carefully and, you know, figuring everything out when they start, because I feel like it takes away the magic, both with, you know, fiction and nonfiction. And I do believe there's very much a place for outlining, just not at the very beginning, generative stage. But with that in mind, you know, like what did I do wrong in this piece? And I think one of the things that I did wrong was I stayed very much, like this piece was like very much in the realm of ideas, you know, like I tried to kind of talk my way through a question that I had rather than really stay close to the sensory concrete world. And like Simon's example of that wonderful detail about the sheepskin rug in Home Depot, that's where story comes from. Whether you're writing poetry or nonfiction or fiction, you don't like reach people by saying, you know, I experienced a loss. You reach people by, you know, telling them what it felt like in your body when you got certain news, you know, like where you cried, like who comforted you, you know, that is what belongs on the page in a first draft. And I think that in addition, like, so I would say, absolutely, you know, write the story, like write what you've been thinking about and write what you can't get out of your head and write toward what you don't understand and stay curious in the writing process. But, you know, with that in mind, always, you know, try to center yourself on the page in the sensory and concrete world. You know, like what did they say? What did you say? Who turned around? You know, what was in the room while this conversation was taking place? Because I really think that, you know, that's the key to so much work that moves us so much. And the other thing that I would say is like, once you have all of those bits of raw material, it can be so helpful to, you know, do kind of an inventory of what's there and what's not there. And I think this is probably true no matter what your genre is. You know, for example, like when I was drafting my memoir, a couple of the scenes that I kept kind of that kept popping up were scenes about me speaking in tongues as a child. You know, there was this scene when I first believed that I spoke in tongues. There was a scene when, you know, I was worshiping with my family at this tent revival. And when I put all of those kind of out, like laid out the content of, you know, those scenes and where they were in the book, you know, it made me realize what was missing. And one of the things that was missing were the scenes in which I discovered I could no longer speak in tongues as an adult if I ever did as a child. You know, like the scenes when, like that's the arc, you know, that's the like that scene, that initial scene of me in like a church bathroom shivering and starting to speak in this language is an interesting situation, you know, like, but it's not yet a story unless it's paired with kind of the other extreme. Like, where did that girl go? Where did that language go? Like, what were the feelings that came along with that? I think that's the beginning of how you get to story. And I think it's really important at some point, once you're in that wonderful free drafting stage where you're not censoring yourself and you're not, you know, talking to yourself about what you can and can't write, it's important at some stage to really probe what's there and what's not there. You know, if you're writing about, you know, the loss of your father, for example, and you talk very much about the grief, but you never talk about the other extreme, like what those moments of connection with him felt like. If that's what your piece is about, that would be a big omission. And then the last piece that I would say is, you know, especially with nonfiction, like it can be really, really challenging to wrap your mind around, you know, even writing honestly about traumatic events that had happened, especially when they involve people that you're still in deep relationship with. And my advice, you know, to students about that is similar to what Jasmine said, like, just write it. You know, you don't have to show it to anybody. And by the time you do get to a place where you've really worked with that material and you've detached from it a bit and you've, you know, polished it and it feels like something kind of outside of yourself, even though it's true, it's likely that you'll have a team of other people around you, an agent, an editor, writer friends, who can help guide you through the sticky kind of ethical situations of, you know, do we write about our children? Do we write about our elderly parents who may not be at their full capacity? You know, do we tell family secrets, you know, that are not potentially ours to tell? Like, there's a lot there, but I don't think those questions belong in the drafting stage. You can feel safe in the drafting stage doing whatever you want, you know, and password protected if you need to, or, you know, lock it up in a safe, whatever you have to do to feel like you are allowed to tell that story, and put those questions about eventually showing them to people. Those are questions for another day.
Yeah, thank you, Jessica. And I loved what you said about the way into a story isn't through thinking, it's through the writing. And I think as writers, we have to find our entry point into a story, but then we also have to find the reader's entry point into a story. So Jasmine, I actually want to come back to you for this next question, because I love the first two sentences of Night Blooming Jasmine. And they read, I don't know if I have the words I need to tell you everything I want to say. I don't know if I have enough creative impulses to get it all down on paper and truly convince you of my story. And that's how you start this book. And so I'm wondering why you started there and what an opening has to do when you're writing about your personal experiences.
Yeah, that's so funny that so many people say how much like they enjoy like that first little excerpt. And that was like at the very last minute, I was like, no, that one needs to be the first essay. And my editor was like, okay, like we're supposed to go to print soon. I was like, just switch it. And yeah, I, you know, to me, a lot of it too was because I was really trying, which was, I don't recommend to anyone. I was trying to write this book while I was still living this experience, which was very, very difficult, because as I'm working, and it took me 10 years, like the earliest piece that I have in there was like from 2018, yeah, like 2007, 2008, when I was first diagnosed. Like I was diagnosed, and then the book is about my multiple chronic illnesses, scleroderma and lupus. And I was diagnosed with scleroderma in 2007, and then lupus in 2012, miscarriage in between, and fertility through all that, right? And like this whole time I'm like writing these essays and like trying to get all these like, you know, feelings down on paper, and like looking at all this like chronic illness narrative theory, and trying to write from the place of chaos, which this one theorist was like, you can't write when it's chaos. Like it either has to be this kind of narrative or this kind of narrative. I'm like, no, I refuse. I'm writing from within the chaos, which was chaotic. And so it was really like, that piece was really like, I've been through, like, I can't make this shit up, right? Like I write memoir because this is better than fiction. Like I can't tell, like I can't even tell you how messed up my whole life is. There are my 20s were, right? Like I'm living with this chronic illness that just would not calm down. And so I own up to that. Like I don't know, like that you will actually believe the number of times I've been in the ER, or the fact that I was awake during a finger amputation. Like I don't know that you are going to actually that, and I don't know if I have the words, right? Like the ability to be able to express what I need to say, because I feel like so much of what we experience in our bodies, the physical pain, like your body is screaming, but it doesn't speak. Do you know what I mean? Like, and there's doctors always asking you how to describe your pain, and I'm like, I'm in pain. Like, I don't know what to tell you. Like, does it tingle? Does it burn? Does it pound? I'm like, it just hurts. Like, and then they want you to put it on a scale of 1 to 10, and I'm like, there's sort of all these layers to describing your pain. And yet to this day, despite of everything that I've been through, I will say that the hardest thing that I've been through was my miscarriage, despite all of the physical anguish and pain that chronic illness has put me through, right? Like the emotional, like on top of the physical of dealing with that was probably the most difficult thing. And so yeah, I think that a lot of me trying to write that book while I was still living it, again, don't recommend, definitely recommend having distance. I know that if I were to write that book now, it would be a completely different book, or it would look different. And the arc would likely be different in that story. Now that I feel like a lot of that part of my life, is behind me in some ways. It could potentially all come back. I'm in a good place of like remission, right? In a much healthier place. And so I think that they would look different now, like reflectively. But yeah, I think that, that to be able to describe, like how pain manifests in the body and dealing and living with chronic pain for over a decade, I just don't know that there are enough words in the English language or the Spanish language, for me to be able to like fully encompass that experience. And so but that book was like, this is my best attempt. Like, here it is. This is what I've got right now, yeah.
Thank you. And I think that's a great point too, about distance and how we absolutely need distance to be able to write about and look at things with a certain perspective. And so Simon, I'm gonna come to you now, and ask you about what you think openings when you're writing about personal experiences should do. But I wanna point to a specific essay recently that I read of yours, and it's Shortcuts to Identity, How We Tell Asian American Stories. And I think the beginning of this essay is so interesting because you're literally speaking to the reader about how you want to even start the essay. And you say to begin an essay with one or the other, and you're talking about Amy Tan and boba tea, is to invite a range of reactions from hypothetical readers, swinging from passionate identification to dismissal to simple apathy. How we feel about them may hinge on not just who, but where and when we are. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit to that essay, and also just in general about what you think an opening should do. Oh, I think.
Sorry. Yeah, thanks for that question. Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm trying to remember what I was thinking. But I think that the essay begins with the word "say" in the way that we use say this happens or say that happens, as a sort of hypothetical, right? And because the essay was interested in like the performance of the self and the way we tell stories about our real or unreal or fictional lives, I think I wanted to put that front and center, like that even to sort of, a teacher of mine always told me, like, the beginning of any piece of writing is also a way, like the beginning of teaching the reader how to read it. And because really they're coming at it with nothing, with very little context. And so when they see, the hypothetical introduced, they're like, okay, so this is going to be an essay that also questions the artifice of writing itself. Like they have a sense of like what what they're in for. I think it also fit with the general idea of like shorthands. In the essay, I was interested in, things that are very much part of my life that because they've been repeated in various literature, Asian American literature, and because for whatever reason, these things tend to stick in the minds of readers and are magnified in a way. So I'm talking about shorthands like bubble tea or Amy Tan, or for an immigrant, like the journey to America, the plane flight to America, or a lot of time, you hear often among immigrants, like the smelly lunchbox story, when you bring your lunch to school and the white kids around you don't get it, so they laugh at you. And these are things that do happen to people, and these are they happen to Asian Americans, and then they don't happen to Asian Americans. And I think the problem of these shorthands is that they become so fraught. People, even Asian Americans get sort of like, I don't like that because that's not my experience. So why did you write about it? But then the writer says, well, that was my experience. And that all, it's not, the problem is not between these individual people. It's the overarching system that tells us that like one single story has to somehow represent an entire uncategorizable population. And so I wanted to kind of defend the shorthands a little bit, because I could feel myself even wincing when I reread parts of my book. I was like, oh, that's in so many books about, with Asian American characters. But I'm like, that's part of these characters' lives. It would be weird to erase it too. And this is all a circular way of saying, like, I wanted then to like just put it front and center and say, okay, here's some thoughts about bubble tea. Here's some thoughts about Amy Tan. They're going to, I'm going to put the fraught stuff up in the beginning, and just, lay my cards out on the table so that I can really get to what I want to say, so that the shorthands don't become distracting. And I'm forgetting if you had another question on top of that.
I was just asking about like openings when you're writing about personal experiences, but I think you got to that.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, and Jasmine, you put in the chat box Chimamanda Adichie's The Danger of the Single Story. And that's what I thought of too when Simon was speaking, and that is such a good tech talk. And her essay on it that is also published is also just an incredible read. So Jessica, I'm coming back to you now. What is your sort of advice, and what are your thoughts on openings when you're writing about personal experiences?
Well, I don't know about Jasmine and Simon, but I think they always change. Like the opening that ends up in the finished piece is very rarely the opening that I started with. I think I try to find the quickest way in, when I'm revising. And I try to front load kind of the most powerful images, or, like something that is sensory, that's not like, I was thinking the other day, like something that's much more grounded. And that's also something like a little bit unexpected, something that hopefully captures the reader's attention a little bit. And Simon, I think it was you who said, like, there's an element that an opening needs to do to teach the reader how to read the piece. And I think that's a huge quality, like I hesitate a lot, when I'm writing about my childhood religion to really kind of lead with a passage that represents me at my most devout, because I don't want, a reader to kind of be under the impression that this is a story of religion for religious people, so I often try to front load, the status of the self being that of like a current non-believer, to try to then seduce the reader into sticking with me when I go biblical, a few pages later. And yeah, I think like I'm curious to go back to different, openings and see if I actually did that. But I think when I pick up, a piece, even if it's a book that I've been really excited to read, I'm probably much more likely to stick with it and keep reading if it does hook me, in the first few sections.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And Jessica, I want to stick with you for this next question, because I think you primarily write in nonfiction, memoir, personal essays, and so much of that is rooted in writing about and pulling from our memories. But our memories are inaccurate. We don't remember things exactly as they happen. And sometimes like time is weird, and it can be really difficult to go to that place and figure out, how to talk about these things that we've experienced. So I'm wondering, when you're relying heavily on your memories to tell a story, how do you go about pulling them into focus? Do you have any techniques or sort of like warm-ups you do before you get started writing, so to sort of like tap into this other part of you?
Yeah, that's a great question. A couple of things. Like I love research. Research is a huge part of my creative process. I have been reading about lately about Zora Neale Hurston and the way that research was really pivotal for her. She has this wonderful quote about how she was studying African American folklore, and she said, I grew up hearing these stories. I grew up, saturated with them, but I couldn't kind of see them because that was my world. It was a tight chemise, and I couldn't see it because I was wearing it. And for me, at least, I feel like when I try to go to kind of the original sources, and that can be like I recently Googled for this essay that I'm working on about my experience with preeclampsia, which is a blood pressure disorder, in pregnancy. I Googled like the original Fisher-Price doctor kit. Did any of you guys have this in the 80s? It's like it has like a little blue rubber hammer, I think, and like a red and yellow blood pressure cuff, and like an orange ear, checker. I don't know what the word is for that, but like those kinds of objects really open doors for me. And some of the other things that help are like, like I was reading when I was writing about the church that we went to when we were kids, I tried to find like YouTube videos of those types of services, which I haven't been to in a long time. That brought back a lot. But also, when you open the door, when you're sitting down and writing, the details come. And I don't get hung up on, I am very committed to kind of a certain idea of truth in my work, but I'm also really conscious that my brother and I have very different, representations of many, many events that happened, or even questions like, were we poor? Which I will say we were poor. Like we think of our world so differently, and we tell different narratives, and there's a lot of ways to kind of check things, and I do that whenever I can. I also, like when I was doing the memoir, I put together like a Word document that was kind of a family timeline, and used kind of the ages and grades that my brothers and I were in, and kind of paired that with other events, and kind of realized some pretty big kind of connection points about what was going on in our family. My dad lost his job, and I never really realized that was what then precipitated something else happening. So there's a lot you can do, with those kinds of things. But I also, in a lot of my work, will be really liberal with the use of like, I think it happened this way, one day, I think it was in this time period, my dad came home and said this, and I might have a line of dialogue if I remember it very clearly, but I moved to paraphrase, when I need to. Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think that it can be a barrier if you let it be, kind of the limitations of memory and whether or not something is true. But I think there are ways stylistically to indicate to the reader kind of what your level of, understanding is about a certain piece.
Yeah, thank you. Jasmine, what about you?
Yeah, very similarly. And when I teach like the memoir personal narrative workshop, I talk about this a lot. I have a whole thing on emotional truth versus factual truth, and really thinking about, right, like what is that you want to say and what is serving this particular piece or the book or this moment, right? Like, does it really matter if your mom had on a yellow sweater or a blue sweater? Like, if you felt in your heart, like what your memory remembers is yellow because yellow like makes you gag. And in that moment you wanted to gag because your mom said something, you know what I'm saying? Like, you really just got like, in what ways? I mean, there's reasons called creative nonfiction for a lot of reasons, right? There's things that details, right, that you can pull in that will reach that emotional truth of the moment rather than necessarily like the factual truth, right? There are some things, you know, like I had a cousin call me out on the book. She was like, actually, grandmother had so many kids, and you know, two of them died in infancy, and you only talked about one of them. And I'm like, well, if nobody in our family's talking about these children, how am I supposed to know these children never? You know what I'm saying? Like, I knew about one of them because we always talked about the one, but we never talked about the other one, right? So little things like that, that like, you know, or my dad will be like, well, actually, I was in this infantry, and I'm like, bro, you never talk about it. So I had to just figure it out, doing some research online, like trying to figure it out myself, you know, and you'll come against those roadblocks, right? Like, depending on how forthcoming your family is or isn't about certain details or their own past or your own childhood past, where if you're like, oh, remember that vacation? And then suddenly your mom's like, oh yeah, it was great. And then you're really like, no, but something was wrong, you know, but they don't want to talk about it. Like, you just have to infer, you just have to kind of like figure out like what really happened, or what was my child self or my, you know, teen self, what was that intuition that I was having in that moment, right? And you can speculate on the page, like Jessica was saying, like you can be forthcoming and saying like, I don't really know what was going on with mom and dad, but it felt like this or that, or there was tension, or I felt like there was anger, you know, like talking about the feelings of the moment and not necessarily like the actual factual truth, because you don't have access to that information for whatever reason, right? They don't want to give it to you or whatnot. And I just definitely encourage writers who are going through that to not get so hung up on, right, those minutia details necessarily as you're writing, as you're drafting, because that can be like a real roadblock. Like, you don't have to know everything that happened, you don't have to remember the exact sequence of certain events in that moment, right? Those are things that you can fill in later, or that you can tell the reader frankly, like, I don't know if this happened first or that happened first, but this is what it felt like, or this is what I remember. The rain was pounding really hard, and like Jessica said, her brother has a different recollection of that. Like, maybe she remembers lightning and he just remembers thunder, whatever it is, right? Like, there's different versions of the truth of the same event. And you can only speak from your version of the truth, knowing that there are other truths that other people experience, right? Just like I say, I have two other siblings, and it feels like we were raised in three completely different ways, in three completely different households, even though we were all under the same roof with the same parents. And I'm just like, what parents did you have? Because that was not my life. Like, you know. And so it's a really interesting sort of tension and dynamic, and I think you have to like lean into that and be okay with what you don't know. I also love research. Sometimes I go into a rabbit hole and like we'll spend hours researching the history of the mango for whatever reason. But all of that in some way finds itself like back in the writing, whether, you know, whether it's in a line or in the way you describe like the first time you ate a mango, even if you don't remember, right, every single detail. You can eat a mango today and be like, oh, well, this must be like what it was like the first time that I ate this thing, right? By just recreating that physical experience, you can then, you know, tap back into that memory, to that moment from the past. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And I think cueing readers into exactly where you're at is really important. Like Jeannie Vanasco, her memoir, The Things We Didn't Talk About When I Was a Girl, I believe like the first sentence is there are gaps, because she struggles with mental health and she's very upfront about the fact that there are gaps in her memory, but that doesn't take away from the fact that the book is her truth. It's her emotional truth. So I love that. Simon, what about you? And feel free to speak to fiction as well, because I know that it's a little bit different when you're also fictionalizing stuff as well.
Yeah, I definitely echo what Jessica and Jasmine are saying about research, and in fiction as well. I don't think research is reserved for like historical fiction or, you know, fiction about like real people, but even fiction that is like very personal, that you think you can fill in all the blanks yourself and then just make up the other stuff, is often elevated by research, because you don't know necessarily what you'll find. Like you can often grasp at a new thread of a story, or just a detail, a peculiar detail that just makes everything click. And I remember, Alexander Chi was saying, like, he always has his students in the revision process, like, add, like, I don't know, like 2 or 3 details that they got from research. Doesn't matter what they wrote in their fiction, they have to do that, and it's their work always gets better. And that was my experience too. I remember, for example, like, there's a character in my novel who is an engineer, and my mom is an engineer, so I grew up like knowing kind of vaguely what she did, and my training is not in that at all. So like, I did talk to her. She was very helpful in giving me some of those technical details, which gave a level of credibility to the book. But in our conversation, she also was, she was mentioning how she would always have these conference calls with people on her team that were based in India. And then I would just ask her more questions about, okay, like, when were you having these calls? Well, because of the time difference, sometimes I'm having it like way early in the morning, 6 a.m. And I started thinking, like, that is right. Like, sometimes my mom would like leave really early in the morning, and then the more I talked to her about it, she didn't even kind of emphasize this herself. It was kind of my interpretation, but like, it made me realize she sometimes talks to these people in India who she's never met face to face. She talks to them in a given day more than she talks to her own family, and that happens a lot in our jobs. But it was sort of in like, I guess that's research. I don't know. It's like talking to my mom, but like, like I that was sort of a detail that made its way into the book, and it really made sense for this particular character who happened to share an occupation with my mom. And I, another thing was like, Plano is this suburb, and as with a lot of suburbs, we don't think of them as having a history. They are just like, or if we, and that's partly like erasing the sort of really awful history in which a lot of these suburbs were created, in which they were made to be very exclusive communities. And but it was really interesting to like do research on my own hometown, because I never thought to go to like this tiny, like, it was like in this old house. And I'm pretty sure the people there thought I was like there for a school project or something. But I learned about, like, for example, that there was this group called the 20 Tough Tamales in Plano. They were like a precursor to the modern day fraternity, a group of young white men who sort of did good deeds, and that's what they called them. Like, that's what they purported themselves to do. And they wore this, like, they all wore these like belts with like skulls on them, and it was kind of silly, but but I was like, God, I have to bring that into my novel. I like that is just an aspect of the world that makes it suddenly come to life for me. And it became really meaningful because my characters were largely immigrants who felt very disconnected from the history of their place. And so they meet another character whose family goes back generations to Plano, and he has one of these belts. And that creates a level of tension where the son kind of is fascinated by this belt, and how in this man's sort of tie to the land, whereas his own parents don't seem to have that connection. And that all happened because of research. So I would just echo how research is important, not just for nonfiction, but fiction.
Thank you so much. Where about at the end of our time. I have a million more questions and I could probably talk to you all for several more hours, but we're not going to do that. And we're going to move into the Q&A session now. So for everyone in the audience, if you want to put any questions in the Q&A, we're going to get started answering those. Okay, so Linda Curcio is asking, as a poet and essayist, I'm curious about her suggestions on integrating poetry into story or essay collections. And I believe this question is for you, Jasmine. So if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's always definitely not a challenge, but I have fun with it. I enjoy it. And it really just depends again on what is it that you're either grappling with, or what is that you're trying to say, and how does poetry serve, part of the story or a purpose, and how does essay serve the book or the piece itself, right? And if you're looking at one specific piece, whereby you're trying to do maybe like a collage or a braided essay, where it's like essay sections, poetry, essay, poetry, et cetera, or braiding 3 different threads with like research, essay, like personal narrative, poetry, right? Thinking about what does each of those sections serve the piece? How does it serve the piece? How does it tell the story that you want to tell? Or how does it grapple with the questions that you want to grapple with? And as I mentioned with Night Blooming Jasmine, a lot of the poems, many of the poems are written as poems because I wanted to share the emotional experience of it versus necessarily like the actual moment of the thing happening, or the story or the scene. I didn't necessarily, or maybe I didn't have a scene to go with that particular experience, but there was definitely like a lot of emotion tied to it. And so really just thinking about and not being afraid, I think, especially when you write creative nonfiction, lyrical essays, collage, braided, whatever it is, to use poetic elements, even if you're not writing like a full-on poem within the piece. Use repetition, use alliteration, use, lots of imagery and things like that, things that feel more like poetry, to really get at the emotional tenor of the piece, I think, is also important. One of my best mentors in my MFA program, said you don't have to give up being a poet to be an essayist. And that just like broke, I was like, genius, like, why did I not think of that, right? Or why did I not realize? Because I was forcing so many of my essays to sound like essays and to have this sort of like voice. And then she's like, but you're a poet and I love your poetry. Where's your, like, where is that lyricism? Where is that imagery? And I think, lean into that. And sometimes you'll have to pull back, and that's what revision is for, right? Like sometimes it's just like, okay, that's too many flowers. Like what's happening? Or whatever it is. But I think if you have that impulse, or that like desire to like have more of that sort of lyrical voice in a piece, I definitely think like just explore it and see what happens. I think.
Thanks, Jasmine. Okay, so next question, it's addressed to Jessica, but I also kind of want to take this moment for all of you to sort of talk about this question. So Cassie is asking, how did your family take the news of your writing about the anger in your family? And I think that speaks to this larger question of like, how do you deal with your family reading your personal work in the first place? So Jessica, if you want to start us off.
Yeah, it didn't go particularly well. I feel like that was a real challenge, that essay, and I think it was just the sheer personal nature, the fact that I was telling a big truth about our family that we didn't even really talk about amongst ourselves, and I was talking about it so publicly. That's kind of in my family verboten. And I thought it was really interesting though, like how like people handled it in really different ways. Like my brothers kind of ignored it, and my mom kind of we did a lot of processing about it, and she was very hesitant to show it to my father at the time, and didn't think he would be able to handle it. And his reaction was actually probably the best of all. My uncle told me at some point that my dad was kind of venting about it, and my uncle said, well, is it true? And Dad's like, yeah, it's true. And I was like, okay, like that's all I can ask for, if he kind of recognized the truth in it. But, with that piece and with all of my work that's about, other people, I like I have kind of a rule of thumb for people who I am in relationship with, who I respect. Like this would not count if, I was talking about someone who had, abused me or traumatized me in the past, or someone that was not currently in my life. But for people who are, it's important for me to show them a piece before it's published. And I don't do that with kind of like a, asking permission kind of thing, or, I don't put that on the table, but I do want a chance to see how it hits them. And I think there are opportunities sometimes that, the thing that you think will be an issue is not an issue at all. And it's actually something very different that causes, a lot of pain that might be avoidable. It might be a small detail that isn't actually integral, to the book or essay.
Thanks, Jessica. Jasmine, Simon, anything to add?
I'll just say the only slight benefit that I have is that a lot, if not many, of my family doesn't speak or read English. So my parents do, and my mom reads everything, and there's fractions of it that just kind of she doesn't really like get sometimes, because her English is good, but it's not like sometimes my essays she's like, that was a lot of she gets kind of a little lost in some of the more essay-y things versus like the poems and the personal narrative. So but I do have my other YA memoir is going to be published bilingually, and I'm really nervous about it because it's going to give more people in my family access to my work. And so and it does share quite a number of things that I experienced in childhood, that I was like witness to, especially relating to my aunts, because we had a lot of my aunts and uncles living with us at one point when they all migrated to the States. And as like a 10, 11-year-old girl, I was just kind of like swirling around all these adults and all of these things happening. And so I wrote about it. And so I'm nervous. So that is I'll let you know how that goes a little later. But overall, if anyone has had any issues with what I've written, they haven't approached me directly. So I've been kind of lucky about that. I did end up having like a very intimate conversation with a close friend about one of my essays that talked about friendships. And so she felt some kind of way about it. And so we did have that conversation post publication after she read it. But it's all good. Like we just had that open discussion. We were, frank about it and honest, and we moved forward. So I felt very lucky in that regard.
Thank you. Simon.
Yeah, I'll just say real quick that I also shared my novel with my family before I published it, not because I thought I was writing about them, but I knew that people would think I was writing about them, and they knew that. And so I sort of wanted to prepare them for that. Obviously, having the fiction excuse helps. Just say it's fiction, but there are definitely going to be things that they recognize of themselves in the characters, but I don't. Yeah, but I think that if it is one of the harder things that they recognized, they haven't really brought that up with me. It was more like surface level details, like, oh, does this character have to go to the same specific college in China that I went to? Like, this is just like one step too much. And I'm like, okay, I can change the college. It's not a big deal. So I guess it remains to be seen how, and I think it's kind of like what you're saying, Jasmine. I don't know how closely they read it, or like, or if they're reading the sort of implications that I was bringing into it. And that's actually interesting, because what I'm bringing to it's not necessarily what any reader is going to take out of it. The story becomes something else for them, and that's something that is ultimately exciting as well.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, well, that's about all the time we have for tonight. But we have partnered with Book People for this event, so you can find a link. We're going to send it out to everyone who's registered, but we're also putting it in the chat box right now. And so you can buy your panelists' books, support an indie bookstore. And yeah, that's it for tonight. Thank you all so much for all of your wonderful insights and for being here. It was great.
Thank you so much.
Bye.